Hello everyone, and this is BioPhoenix here, and today we are starting up a new series, and that being a top list of my 30 favorite games on each console. And this one, we're starting off with the NES. And there is no need for an introduction for any of the consoles I'll be talking about here, but yes, I really want to talk about 30 random games that I really love on each system that I spent a lot of time on. And just to go over things quickly is that I will try to at least name one game per franchise just so I'm not clogging up the whole thing with like a bunch of random games in the same series. And just because I rank a game higher than another game doesn't mean I think it's 100% better than it in every way possible. Because some of these games are pretty hard to compare with each other because there's just so many different genres I wanted to include in here. But I just say, look at this as a huge recommendation list, because there's a lot of games in here coming from the more well-known stuff, and the lesser-known obscure titles that I think deserve more attention. So yeah, I'm probably going to be repeating that a lot whenever I continue doing the next videos on this subject with the other consoles, but anyways, let's just get right to it. So at number 30, we have is Arkista's Ring. Yeah, we're starting this list off of a very obscure one. So this is a game that I reviewed on this channel many years ago, and as you can tell that I put it in here, yeah, I really like this one. So to sum up quickly, is that it has like a top-down view perspective and looks very much like a Zelda game, but it's more linear and more arcade style. So as soon as the level starts, you just walk around, kill all the enemies, pick up the key items, and then use those items to open up the door to get to the next level, and you just do that over and over again. So it is one of those games that, yes, it does get kind of repetitive after a while, but it is strangely addicting for me. And this game has a lot of levels too. There's at least 125 stages as far as I remember. And after playing it more recently, yeah, I still like this game for what it is. It's nothing like super fantastical, but I enjoy it for what it is. So let's get moving on to number 29, and that's gonna be Journey to Siluous. Now, the origin of this game is pretty interesting, but it's pretty well known, so I won't go super in-depth about it, but I will just say that this game was originally going to be a Terminator game, but they couldn't get the rights to it, so they had to make up their own thing. So there are definitely some little Terminator-like looking enemies in this game, which is kinda cool. So it's a run-and-gun action platformer, and certainly won't be the last one I'll be mentioning on here. And the one thing I have to mention with this game that you cannot ignore is that the music in this game is fan-frickin-tastic. So catchy, and there's a lot of songs that definitely sound like they would be perfect for metal covers. It's just great. Now, if this was going to be a top list on my favorite NES soundtracks, this would be up there for sure. But as for the game itself, it's pretty good at what it does, but I wouldn't say it's the best, but still very enjoyable. So, the levels themselves, they're not too long for the most part, but they can be pretty damn challenging, but nothing that is stupidly unfair. They are challenging enough that when you do beat a level that is giving you a hard time, I do feel like it is very satisfying. But I should also mention too, and this is actually my one complaint with the game, is that the special weapons in this game all have limited ammo, and they seem like they run out very quickly because you're going to be using them a lot for the boss battles. So I wish they gave you a little bit more. Also, the other thing I have to mention is that while the controls for the most part are good, the jumping is not perfect. It's not unplayable, it's not even really bad at all, but it feels a smidge stiff. Yeah, a smidge stiff. Yeah, I don't think I've ever said those two words together on here before, but now I have. Well, yeah, anyways though, yeah, other than those two things, I think this is a very enjoyable game that I think is quite fun, and yes, maybe the music is the best part, but I still think the gameplay is still very solid and enjoyable. And moving on to number 28, we have Kickle Cubicle. Yeah, I always liked the name of this game. I always thought it was amusing to say. Well, anyways, this is a puzzle game, kinda similar to the Adventures of Lolo, but you play as a snowman and you freeze enemies into ice blocks, and you can push those blocks into openings so then you can create a pathway to get to the other side and collect all the different items. There's quite a bit of levels in this game, and just like I said with Arkista's Ring, this is another one that I find to be pretty addicting, and I really like the music a lot in this one. It's a very upbeat soundtrack which really fits with the game, and even though this is a port from an arcade game, I think it looks really good for what it is and does play really well. So I'll end this one off by saying that it's a pretty chill game. And moving on to number 27, we have Adventure Island 2. So before we get talking about the game, I do want to say that this is a game I actually grew up with. I didn't own it back in the day, but I remember renting it, and I also remember reading about it in this book I used to rent out from the library that talked about NES games. Yeah, my library actually had something like that. So the nice colorful graphics of this game is really what appealed to me the most and why I wanted to rent the game when I saw it in that book. And then when I played it, and yeah, I think it's actually a very fun and enjoyable game. It's one of those action platformers that's very fast paced, has a lot of levels. The levels are really short, but they can be very challenging, and there's also some pretty cool upgrades of all the random animals that you can ride on. And getting the skateboard power-up was always exciting to get. And one amusing thing is that your character can die of starvation if he doesn't pick up enough food items, and even though he literally just ate a bunch of bananas, if he doesn't eat like a couple more in like the next couple minutes, like, he'll die. Now, while this does sound like it would be pretty frustrating to deal with, I never found it to be a huge problem, mainly because the levels in the game are short enough that it never becomes a huge problem. The only time it will is that if you accidentally miss a couple food items. But yeah, I always thought this was a very fun game. I wouldn't say it's my favorite Adventure Island game, but out of the NES ones, I would say it is my favorite, though mainly because of the nostalgia factor of the fact that this was the first one that I ever played. And yeah, I do like Adventure Island 1 for what it is. 3 I've actually never played at all, weirdly enough. And then the 4th one was a Japan-only game that changed up the gameplay quite a bit. It was actually more like a Metroid game. And that one I did play for a little bit, and I did really like it, but I will admit, I'm not the greatest at those exploration type games, so it's one of those games I always got lost in all the time, but I can see a lot of people saying that that would be their favorite Adventure Island game on the NES. Either way though, it's still a really cool game that is definitely worth honorable mentioning, but for me personally, Adventure Island 2, I just think it's just a fun time. And next up, we're moving on to number 26, and that is Bio Warrior Dan. So this is a game that I reviewed on the channel a couple years ago, and yes, it's a Japan-only game that I thought was pretty damn good, and I really wish we would have got it back in the day. Although we almost did, and there was actually a prototype of that floating around on the internet, and the title of it was going to be Bashi Bazooka Morphin Masher, which is a pretty fucking stupid name, but anyways, I went over that in my whole review on it, so I won't go super in-depth about it here, but I will say that this was actually a really cool exploration game, sort of Metroidvania-ish, but I found this one was a lot easier to navigate through. And one thing I thought was interesting is that with the time limit in this game, it doesn't like kill you as soon as it runs out. Instead, the time limit all depends on like how strong the boss will be, so if you do get to the boss faster, then he'll be a lot easier to take down, which I think is pretty interesting, because like I said, I never really liked the whole like, oh, you died because the time limit ran out, because oh no, what, did the world blow up? Well, in this game, they actually made it pretty interesting, and I kinda like that. So that's all I'll say on this one for now, as I did do a whole video on it, so if you want to hear more of my in-depth thoughts on it, then you can go watch that, and I'm happy to have put it in my top 30. And moving on to number 25, we have Blades of Steel. Now, I will go out and say that, typically speaking, I'm not a huge fan of sport games, but the only sport games I do like are the ones that are very unrealistic and are very arcadey, and this game is very much that. And this is a game that I actually grew up with. It was one of the few games that came with my NES when I found it at a yard sale. So I did play it quite a bit, and yeah, even though, like I said, not crazy into sport games, I did really like this one as a kid. It was just very fun, fast-paced, and just a very nice, chill time. I don't know what else to say here, but do you all want me to start talking about a bunch of hockey stuff? Probably not, but if I am going to be playing a hockey game, this one is definitely going to be on there. And now, moving on to number 24, we have Air Fortress. Now this is a game that I rarely hear people talk about. So it's kind of like a space shooter that has two different phases. So you got the first phase where you're just flying around in a ship shooting at stuff, which, you know, sounds like a shoot 'em up, right? But then you go to the second phase where you get to invade an air fortress, or should I say, the Death Star. And once you go inside the Death Star looking thing, then you go on foot, and then you just gotta fly around in there and try to reach for the core, and then plant the bomb, and then get the fuck out of there before it explodes. And you just gotta do that throughout the whole game. I think it's a pretty cool concept, and it's also very thrilling to play, because it is a very intense game once you plant the bomb and then have to, like, get out before the time runs out. And the game starts out pretty easy for you to get used to, but then gets pretty difficult later on. And this is a game that I almost beat, but man, this game gets really tough. But I find it to be very enjoyable and satisfying, and it's also just a really cool game that was put out by HAL Laboratory, definitely very different than a lot of other stuff they're putting out. And next, at number 23, we have is Bucky O'Hare. So this is a game that was based after a cartoon that was based after a comic. So this is one of those things that I literally didn't know exists until many years later. The one funny thing is that I actually did have a toy of one of the characters. It was Deadshot Duck. Yeah, I had a toy of him randomly for some reason, and I had no idea where he came from. But then when I played this game, I realized, oh shit, I had a toy of him as a kid. So I thought that was amusing, but yes. This is a very different game than the arcade game. This one is more of an action platformer, with a lot of similarities to Mega Man, such as turning into a different character that has a different type of shot, or different abilities that can help you get through the levels. And also, just like Mega Man, the game is very damn difficult. At least for me, it's pretty damn hard, but it is one of those games that I still go back to every once in a while, and I always still enjoy it just as much, even when I do get my ass kicked. But if you do want to play as a green buddy in space shooting at shit, then you can't go wrong here. And moving on to number 22, we have Crystalis, which happens to be a top-down action RPG from SNK of all people. It's very rare to see a company like SNK make a game like this, and you know what? I think they did a damn good job, especially for the time that this game came out for. Also, another odd thing I have to mention about Crystalis is that the name in Japanese is called Godslayer, which I think is a really badass name. So yes, very similar to a lot of other games like this. It's top-down, you swing your sword at things, you gain EXP, you can get new equipment to equip to your character, and there is a fair bit of grinding you do have to do in this game, but I do feel like that the grinding in this game isn't super insane compared to many others that came out around the time. And keep in mind too, this is not a game I grew up playing back in the day. When it came to RPGs on NES, I grew up with the very first Final Fantasy and the first Dragon Quest, or also known as Dragon Warrior. And those games do hold a special place in my heart because I grew up playing them a lot. But where Crystalis, I didn't grow up playing it at all, and I thought it was pretty manageable to play through. Of course, the game is not a cakewalk, but I did find that the challenge was still pretty fun. And next up, at number 21, we have Gudnak. And yes, the cover art for this game in North America is absolutely hilarious. A spaceship shooting at a bunch of carrots. It's so stupidly random, and I love it. And yes, it is kinda accurate for the game, so not only is the game just random as hell, but it's also pretty damn good as well. In fact, it might actually be one of the best shoot-'em-ups that I played on the system. The graphics and music are great, and like I said, I really like the randomness that the game has. And there is even a shop where you can buy items and upgrades for your ship, which I do think is really nice. So yeah, I'm sure at least a lot of you have played a shoot 'em up at least once before, so there's no confusion here, but I can definitely say that if you're gonna play a shoot 'em up on the NES, this one is definitely a must. And moving on to number 20, we have Worm Journey to the Center of the Earth. This is definitely one of the most unique games you can get on the NES, and I think it's a damn good one. So you have shoot 'em up stages where you play as a little digger thing, digging through a bunch of dirt while you're also shooting at a bunch of enemies. There's also side-scrolling action platforming sections, and there's even some first-person RPG battles. So it has a lot of variety, and like I said, I think it's all done pretty well. Although yeah, I will say that the shoot 'em up sections are maybe not on the same level as Gudnak, which I just talked about, but it still plays really well. And then the story in the game I also think is really cool. You also get some really nice cutscenes as well. But as much praise that I'm giving this game for it being very unique and quirky is that I do find that the controls for the action platforming sections, they're not the best, they aren't the most fluent you'll ever play, but they still feel good enough that it's at least enjoyable. So if you've never played or heard of this game before and you think it sounds cool, I definitely think it is worth giving a try, for that it is one of the most unique games you can play on the system. Even if it ends up not being in your top 10 favorites or whatever, I still think that the experience is very memorable. And moving on to number 19, we have a very popular title, and that happens to be a Mega Man game. But which Mega Man game I'm gonna talk about, because there's 6 of them. but I think I'm gonna mention the first one that I ever played, which I rented back then, and that happened to be Mega Man 3. Now, I'm sure there are people screaming at me, telling me that they want me to talk about the second game. And yeah, don't get me wrong, the second game is great and iconic and was pretty much the breakout hit for that it improved so much over the first game. But the third game had some really cool improvements that I really liked, such as the sliding ability. Plus, I really like most of the stages within the third game a lot. Maybe it's just because of the fact that it was like my first experience with a Mega Man game, but it really stuck with me. Probably one of the coolest looking stages in my opinion would have to be Snake Man stage. I always thought that one just looked really awesome. And the one thing that I liked about Gemini's stage was the fact that you can just keep shooting at those little bubble things and they just drop out like a bunch of loot. I always found that was very satisfying. And finally I'll mention is Top Man stage. I always liked the way that stage looked, like the blue and the green together. Just looks really nice, even though the leaves in the background kind of look like weed leaves. But yeah, that's all I'm gonna say about this one, as that I'm sure you all know enough about Mega Man already, and there's not really a whole lot that I can say that hasn't been said before. But I do think all of the Mega Man games on NES are all good in their own ways. It's just the third game, it's just my personal favorite. As I've said before, it was the one that kind of got me into the series. And moving on to number 18, we have yet another very popular series, and that happens to be Castlevania. But which one am I going to talk about? So I can say for sure that the third Castlevania game probably has like the most coolest features in it, for that you can play as multiple characters, there's also different pathways you can take. So for that alone, I should say that's my favorite, but unfortunately, the one complaint I have with that game is that the difficulty is just way too insanity for me. It feels like running into a brick wall constantly and it just stops being fun, which is a shame because I like everything else about the game. And then Castlevania 2, Simon's Quest, is probably the most divisive game in the series, for that some love it, some hate it. As for me, I was always kind of in the middle about it. I do like that they tried something different and experimental, but did it all work well? It was kind of hit and miss. I felt like there were some parts about it that were a bit too cryptic, and then there was also some boss battles that were way too easy to a point where you didn't even really have to do anything to beat them. But there were other aspects I did like the whole exploration idea and the fact that you get currency in the game and you got to buy items and such. And that whole idea led to the creation of Cynthia the Knight, which created a whole phenomenon. So I have to give Simon's Quest some big credits for that, but as for the very first Castlevania, I think this one is probably my favorite out of the three. It's more simple, straightforward, easy to pick up and play, and it also has the right balance of difficulty. Although it's still hard as shit, but I do think it's way more manageable than the third game, and also is not so much of a headache compared to the second game with all the cryptic stuff you gotta do. Even though we have plenty of other Castlevania games out there, and a shit ton of games that are inspired by Castlevania, I still sometimes go back to this one for good old time's sakes. And this is not a game I grew up playing either. I actually didn't play this game until 2007, I want to say. So as I keep saying with a lot of these more popular titles, there's not a whole lot else I could say about it that hasn't been said before, but yeah, I still really enjoyed the original Castlevania for what it is. And moving on to number 17, we have Power Blade 2. Now I will go out and say, I do think both Power Blade games are both very good and fun, but I think I want to mention Power Blade 2. I think this one I might like a smidge more, but they're both great. So it's an action platformer where you throw a boomerang and your main character looks like Arnold. Especially on that title screen, it's just pretty awesome looking. And there's a few things about this game that do remind me of the Mega Man series, for that you can select any level you want. Also, transition to different screens with that doorway that opens and closes kind of looks similar to the ones in Mega Man, and there's even a boss rush towards the end. But the one thing that I do like about this game, better than Mega Man, and I know this might be shocking to hear, but I like that you can throw the boomerang in multiple directions without having to jump in front of the enemy's face. And while that does sound like it makes the game a whole lot easier, and yeah, I would say that the games are slightly easier, but they still manage to put up a tough challenge that is fun to overcome. Plus, another thing I have to point out is that I really do love the graphics in this one. I like all the different detail that they put into the backgrounds and such. It all just looks really awesome. So yeah, overall, I like both of the Power Blade games, but I think I like the second one just a little tiny bit more, but they're both still worth playing. And now we're moving on to number 16, and that happens to be Wacky Races. This is another game that I reviewed years ago on my channel, but given that it's a really old-ass video, I'll probably talk more about it here. But the first thing I want to mention is that Wacky Races is one of those cartoons that I grew up watching a lot as a kid. Yeah, even growing up in the 90s when I was watching Pokemon and all that, I still really enjoyed watching a lot of the Hanna-Barbera stuff that was on reruns, and Wacky Races was one of my favorites. I always thought that Dick Dastardly and Muttley were very amusing characters. So that's my little origin with it, and when I found out that there was an NES game that was not a racing game, and it was developed by Atlas, I had to play it. And you know what? The game ended up being pretty damn good. So you play as a dog Muttley, and you attack enemies with your mouth, either by biting them, or by barking at them really loud. And you collect bones for different power-ups, such as different projectile attacks, or even the ability to heal yourself. And most of the bosses that you fight are the good guy characters within the show, and I do think it is kind of cool that they made a video game based after a cartoon where you don't play as the good guys, you play as the bad guys, which I think is awesome. But the main thing that I really like about this game is that it has really good controls, and the levels are just fun and chill, and are not crazy hard. Although it does get hard later on, of course, but it's still not, like, crazy hard or anything. I find this is one of those good, chill platformers that you can just go back to anytime. And I also consider it to be one of the best licensed games you can get on the NES. And it still cracks me up that this game is not a racing game. I don't know, it's just one of those things you just would never expect. And yeah, and it's damn good. And next, we're moving on to number 15, and that happens to be Wampum. Yeah, not really the greatest name for a game, but I do have an interesting story with this one. So many years ago, I was downloading some NES games, and I was trying to look for some different stuff that I didn't have, and I saw a game on there called Sayuki World 2. And I downloaded it because I was like, oh, this sounds kind of cool. And I played it for a while, and I thought it was a really cool game. And then a couple years have passed, I find a game called Wampum, I play that one, and then I realized it was literally the same damn game. So I always thought it was funny how I played the Japanese version first before realizing that there was actually a North American version the whole time. But then again, having a game called Wampum doesn't really strike me as anything fancy, so that's probably why I avoided it. So anyways, this is yet another action platformer where you fight with a spear, and you also have different selecting stage levels, and all the stages do look really nice. And the thing that's cool with the spear weapon is that not only can you just hit them normally just in front of you, but you can also hit them in the air while like pointing down or pointing up, and you can even block projectiles with it. So the game provides you a lot of fair ways to defend yourself and also to make some offensive moves, but the game still manages to be a little bit challenging here and there, but as I always keep saying, I do feel that the balance of difficulty is fair and just feels just right. So yeah, this is just one of those random-ass NES games that barely anyone played when it came out. I mean, hell, even I didn't play it when it came out, for, like I said, I played the Japanese version first. But man, this was a very good, solid game that I just really like a whole lot. Alright, and moving on to number 14, we have yet another very popular one. And this one might be surprising, but I'm gonna mention a Zelda game. And to make it even more surprising, I'm gonna talk about Zelda 2. Yeah, between the two Zelda games, I like the second one a bit better, mainly because it's more experimental and different, and I still think it's just a really cool game. While the first one I do think is good for the time it came out, and of course is very influential in many ways, I feel like that Link to the Past is pretty much my go-to when it comes to the top-down Zelda-like. Also, this is another game that I actually grew up playing for that it came with the NES I got at the yard sale. So I don't need to go like crazy detail about this game because I'm sure everyone here knows about it. But I've always really enjoyed this one. I always enjoyed the perspective of it. I like the fact that it has EXP in the game. I always thought that was very interesting. Going to a new town was always very exciting. And just the whole adventure aspect I really liked. For an example, seeing that boulder that blocks your path at the very beginning of the game, as a kid, that always bothered me, and I was just dying to know what was on the other side of that boulder. And then once I finally got that hammer and broke that shit down, then the excitement started back up again, and I was just really hyped. But unlike the other games that I've been talking about lately that I said that were more like chill and relaxing to play, Unfortunately, this game is definitely not chill and relaxing. This game is pretty damn hard. And yeah, even to this day, I'm still not very good at it, and the whole Death Mountain section I think is just way too hard for how early that part is in the game. But once you beat the shit out of that part, then you just feel like you're on top of the world. And then I remember that one dungeon that appears in that one town where you gotta play the flute in front of it. I remember that dungeon was pretty hard too. So yeah, I know this is definitely a very pulverizing game. You got some that love it, some don't. For me, put it in the love it category, but I wouldn't say it's my favorite Zelda game ever, but out of the NES ones, I do tend to go back to this one more often, and I still enjoy it. And now we're moving on to number 13, and we have Ninja Gaiden 2. Yet another very popular one that I don't need to say a whole lot on, but yes, I would say Ninja Gaiden 2 is my favorite out of the 3 NES games. Now, I don't need to spend whole much time on talking about the one thing that everybody's thinking about, but yes, this game is hard as shit. And yes, it has a lot of those hazardous stages, like the wind stage that blows you around, and the one where the lights go out randomly, which yeah, those are a pain in the ass stages. But compared to some of the levels in the other 2 games, I find they are somewhat manageable, but that might be just because of the fact that I played Ninja Gaiden 2 way more, and the fact that I know the levels a lot better. And another thing to consider too is that in Ninja Gaiden 2, I actually made it to the final boss of that game. Unfortunately, I never beat him, but the fact that I actually got there, I was impressed by that, because in the first game, I still get stuck at that stupid 6-2 level. But anyways, that's all I'm gonna say about the difficulty. But yes, we all know it's fucking hard as shit, but I still really enjoyed like the fast-paced action that this game has, and I do find that like the music is great, the levels all look really cool, and beating all these stages and bosses is always satisfying for me. And I still put it up there as one of my favorite games from the company Tecmo, and I think it would be really cool if they made another Ninja Gaiden game in the style of the NES ones. I think that'd be really nice. But that's just wishful thinking though. But yeah, anyways, with that being said, Ninja Gaiden 2, as challenging as the game is, I still really enjoy it. And moving on to number 12, we have Felix the Cat. So we go from talking about a game that's hard as shit to a game that's not hard as shit. Yeah, this is actually one of those more chill and relaxing type of platformers, very similar to what I said about Wacky Races. So like I just said, this is a really cool platformer that's very fun to play, has good controls, it's also not too brutally hard or anything like that, it feels just right with the balance of difficulty. And I really like the different power-ups and vehicles that Felix can drive throughout the level. I think a lot of them are very cool and fun to use. And there's some pretty decent variety levels as well, like you got the typical platforming levels, you got some underwater stages, you got flying stages, and you got ones where you just swim on the back of the dolphin. And the game isn't crazy long either. It's a good, short, but sweet game that I always did really like, and it's one of those games that was considered very underrated for a long time, but I feel like a lot of people have definitely sung its praises over the years, and well, I can definitely see why. Alright, and moving on to number 11, we have a very obscure one, and that is Moon Crystal. This is another Japan-only game that I did review on my channel a couple years ago, and this is one that I've always really enjoyed. So firstly, I have to mention is that the graphics in this game are probably some of the best you'll ever see on the NES. A lot of really cool details, some really cool animation with the sprites. The animated cutscenes that play in between levels are really cool looking and definitely look very Ninja Gaiden-like. And the music is great too. It kind of gives off this sort of dark adventure aspect to it that I really like. And yeah, I won't say a whole lot else about it there for that. I did do a video on this one a couple years ago, and I'd still think it's a pretty decent one that I did. So yeah, there you go. A game with a very cool name ended up actually being a cool game. And now we are moving on to the top 10. So in the 10th spot, we have Star Tropics. So this is another game that's pretty well known, I feel like, but the one thing that is pretty interesting is that Japan didn't get this game. Yeah, this is a game that only North America and Europe got. And it ended up being a pretty cool adventure game, so it has like a similar Zelda style to it where, you know, you walk around on an overworld map, you go to towns and you talk to people and you find items that could possibly help you out, and when you get to a main dungeon, things start changing a little bit, but it's still top-down, and you just get to jump across different platforms, you fight with a yo-yo, and I always really like the vibe that this game has. And for anyone that's wondering, yes, I actually did play the second game, Zoda's Revenge, which I also do like, but I like the first one a bit better though, but that may be just because of the fact that I'm more familiar with it, because Zoda's Revenge, I only played for a little bit, and it seemed good, but I didn't think it was as memorable as the first game. But either way, they're both very good games, but I think that the first one definitely has a whole place for me. And now, moving on to number 9, we have Guardian Legend. This is yet another game that I've always really enjoyed a whole lot, for that it combines two things, shoot 'em up stages and top-down action-adventure, and both are done very well. So the shoot 'em up stages are very fun, not too difficult, and feel just right, and they also do look really good too. And the top-down parts that are sort of Zelda-like also look really nice too. Yeah, it is very maze-like, and there are some parts that do look a little bit the same, so it can be a little bit confusing to navigate, but I never felt like it was too annoying. And this is a game that you really do need to explore around and get better upgrades for your character, so even if you do end up getting a little bit lost, it never feels like it's completely worthless. So yeah, when it comes to the top-down adventure games on NES, this is definitely one of my all-time favorites. Alright, now moving on to number 8, we have Chip 'n Dale Rescue Rangers. This is another game that I grew up renting as a kid. In fact, this is actually another one of those games that I found out about through that book I rented from the library, the same one I talked about in Adventure Island 2. They also had stuff about this game, and I remember seeing those screenshots, and it was like, man, this game looks really awesome. And thankfully, it did not disappoint, because this game is just a whole lot of fun, just to be able to just pick up boxes and throw them at the enemies. Also, I've always liked the way that the levels are, because you're so tiny and everything is so big. It's kind of like the whole macro zone from Super Mario Land 2 and the 6 golden coins, and I always loved levels like that, where you're really small and everything is huge. The music is really great. In fact, I really love the last theme stage. I think it was stage J. That one has such an awesome song. And like I've been saying about a lot of the other platformers here, this is another one of those games that's just very chill, relaxing, and not too bullshit hard at all. It feels just right. Yeah, maybe some of the bosses I wish were a little bit more aggressive, but, you know, that's just a minor thing. Everything else about the game is just so good and fun that it's pretty easy to look past that. And it's yet another licensed game on NES done right. Alright, moving on to number 7, we have Kokoro. Now you're probably wondering, what the fuck is this game? And here's the funny thing, this is a game I didn't play until last year. So to me, the experience of this game is still very recent, and I can definitely say, this is a very impressive game with many cool ideas to it. So the first cool thing I have to mention is that this is an action platformer where you actually get to create your own character. Yeah, this game has a create a character feature. How awesome is that? And there's many different parts you can combine together to create your own unique character that can play through the level in very unique ways. So there's a lot of different replay value and strategies you can use throughout this game, which I think is really awesome. But the other thing that I thought was really cool about this game is that there's a lot of really cool level themes and ideas that I think are really awesome looking, and probably the most impressive part about the levels is that you can stage select to any level you want, but the thing that's interesting is that for the second level that you select after the first one, you have to go through a little unique stage where it goes from the first level that you did and transitions to the second level that you picked, and I think that's just really freaking cool. I don't think I've ever seen another game do that before. But without all like the cool shit that I'm talking about here, the gameplay itself is still really well made and well done and is still very fun. The boss battles are fun, the challenge is just right, but it also really depends on the type of character you create, because there are some characters that are a little bit harder to use than others. But yeah, this was definitely one of the biggest surprises that I found within recent years, and yep, it ended up being one of my all-time favorite NES games for sure, so yes, in case you haven't heard of this game before, it's definitely worth checking out. Alright, and moving on to number 6, we have Kirby's Adventure. So yes, Kirby is one of those series that you really can't go too much wrong with. I mean, most of the games are usually consistently good. And even this really old-ass one, I still go back to it every now and again, and it's not just because I grew up with the game, even though I definitely did, but I still think it's just a very fun time with a lot of great levels, great music, and there were some iconic power-ups that started within this game. So yeah, I don't really think I need to say much about Kirby. I mean, you know, it's one of the most popular series from Nintendo for sure, and it is the pinnacle of chill platformers. And next up for number 5, we have Guerrilla War. from SNK. Now this game right here is basically Ikari Warriors done right. Because personally, I found that the very first two Ikari Warriors games were not really that good, and the third Ikari Warriors game was surprisingly decent and kinda underrated, but I do find that Guerrilla War is definitely where it's at. So that the speed of the game doesn't feel too slow, it feels just right, the balance of difficulty is good, and you get a generous amount of continues, which is nice. The power-ups are very fun and satisfying to use on enemies and bosses, and even playing the game 2 players, I feel like it doesn't make the game slow down that badly. The fact that they nailed an NES port from an arcade game like this, I think it's just done really well, and I still go back to it every once in a while because I just think it's just a great top-down shooter. And as I've said a couple times, this is yet another game that I first got with my NES at that yard sale, and man, this is one that I put in a lot of time into. Alright, and next up for number 4, we have Vice Project Doom. And this is a game I definitely did not grow up with, but man, I really wish I did, because I would have loved the shit out of it. I mean, I still love the shit out of it, but man, playing this game as a kid would have blew my mind. So just like a lot of other games that I've mentioned on here, this game has a lot of different game modes and play styles, so I know that the first time you play this game, it starts out as looking like a Spy Hunter type game, which is pretty fun. Then it goes to the side-scrolling action stuff where you use a sword and a gun, and it's just so much fun. Good music, great graphics that are very impressive for the time it came out, and the controls are really good, and the game, yeah, this one is actually pretty tough, but I do think it's forgiving enough, and still manages to be really fun once you overcome those levels. And I'm glad that this game is finally getting the recognition that it deserves, because I remember when I first discovered this game back in like 2010, 2011, I remember nobody talked about this game. Very few people did, and yeah, a lot of people have been talking about it more ever since they put it on the Switch Online service, and well, I'm glad that they did, because yes, this game is fucking awesome. Alright everybody, we're in the top 3 spot, and as for number 3, we have Kabuki Quantum Fighter. And this game is really fucking awesome. I remember a good old YouTube friend of mine named Rewind Mike was the one who told me about this game, and when I played it, I immediately loved it. I even did a review on it years ago, and I will be honest, it's definitely not one of my best, but that's okay. I know a few people loved it for the stupid random ending that I made for that shit. But anyways, this is a really cool action platformer where you play as a Kabuki warrior who gets sent into a computer system and has to fight off a bunch of monsters in there. And yeah, the game's graphics are really cool looking, very cyberpunk, with a lot of very cool and unique enemies. And you got a lot of different weapon variety with different types of projectile shots, and probably the most hilarious one is that you can even kill people with your hair. Yeah, this guy was doing it before Shantae did it. And I also really like the game's animation. Whenever your guy jumps across like different hangars, it just looks really cool. And the music is just very fast-paced and fits with the action. But as much as I do love this game, it is by no means an easy game. This game is pretty damn tough. But even after all the times that I've died in this game, I still keep going back to it because it's just so much fun. And I can say that it is one of my most highly recommended action platformers to play on the NES. Just keep in mind that yes, it can be a very tough game at times, but it's not too ridiculous like Ghosts and Goblins or anything like that. It's way more manageable. And one last thing I do want to mention about this game is that it was developed by Human Entertainment, who has done all kinds of weird and quirky games, and yeah, a lot of them are really cool and fascinating, but it's cool to see them do an action platformer, and man, they frickin' nailed it. Alright, now let's get ready for number 2, and we have Super C, or also known as Super Contra. Yeah. So here's the thing. Both Contra games, whether you're talking about the original or Super C, both are fantastic games as far as I'm concerned. But if I had to pick one, Super C is the one that I'm going with, because this is the one that I grew up playing. You know, just like the whole thing I've been talking about is that it was one of those games that came with my NES when I found it. So I put a lot of time into this game. And I've also died a lot in this game, because as you know, this game is by no means easy. But it is so damn addicting, and I just never get tired of it. But one funny thing I do have to mention about this game is that I always thought it was hilarious that your character dies in one hit when someone touches him. Yeah, so you got these like green guys jogging at you, and they just touch you once, and you're dead. And your guy is like jacked up looking, like, you know, he has like the body of Arnold after all, so, you know, it's just kind of funny that he dies from that. Yeah, I know, it sounds like I'm complaining, but I'm not. I just think it's just hilarious. But anyways, though, despite being killed in one hit, this game manages to be somewhat forgiving, though, for that you get a decent amount of continues, and plus you got the Konami code. Granted, the Konami code in this game doesn't give you as much lives compared to the original game, but it still gives you a decent amount. Being able to shoot in multiple directions is just so damn fun. The spread gun is just amazing to use. Even the machine gun I also really like too, just because you don't have to keep tapping the button constantly. Lots of very cool set pieces and graphics, and of course I really love the music a lot. A lot of the songs always get stuck in my head. But yeah, I don't know what else I can say about Contra that hasn't been said before. They're both just masterpieces on the NES, and they're just staple games, but I have to say Super C is my favorite for, like I've been saying, I grew up with it and I spent the most time on it. Alright, before we get to the number one spot, we're gonna do a little mini honorable mention where I'll just list off the titles without going too much into it, because I think this video is already long enough as it is, and I know there's probably gonna be someone out there who's gonna be like, oh, you forgot about this game. Well, do you want me to just list off the entire damn library at this point? So anyways, let's begin. So there's DuckTales, Conquest of the Crystal Palace, The Magic of Scheherazade, Chronicle of Radia War, Metal Slater Glory, Panic Restaurant, Rockin' Cats, Cowboy Kid, and finally, I'll mention The Lone Ranger. Now, I will be honest and say, I did not put a lot of time into that game, but from what I did play of it, I liked it enough that I can definitely see myself going back to it, and I thought it was really cool looking. So yeah, that's all the ones I'm going to be mentioning for now. Like I've said, I know there's like a bajillion more, but honestly, we'd be here forever. So now, let's get moving on to the final game in the number one spot, and that happens to be Super Mario Bros. 3. Yeah, I know, it's a very cliche pick, but honestly, there's really nothing bad I can really say about this game. And it goes to show you that even Nintendo is still trying to capture the same magic that this game has with all their new Super Mario Bros. Games. They're literally just trying to be like this game. And don't get me wrong, some of the new Super Mario Bros. Games are fine and good for what they are, but this game, I still go back to this one. And yeah, I mean, do I really need to say anything else about it? I mean, you all know why this game is the way it is. I mean, shit, they even made a fucking movie about it, called The Wizard. Like, what more else do you want me to say on it? Well, anyways, yeah. We all already know that Super Mario Bros. 3 is a fantastic game. I don't need to go in depth about it because, well, if you never heard of it, then how the fuck did you manage to make it here? So yeah, no surprise, that's my number one NES game. And no, not every single Mario game is going to be my number one on all the different consoles, I'll tell you that right now. But for the NES, I think this game captures everything that's great about it. So I think I'll end it off here and just say that, yeah, this was very fun, very difficult to put together, and I'm pretty happy with it. So for all you guys out there that have been listening to me long enough, you guys should list your favorite games on NES. You don't have to do 30 of them like I did because, you know, I understand that's kind of a lot. But as long as you list the ones that you really enjoy, that's what matters. And it doesn't have to be like mine. Like, you can mention, like, totally different other games that I didn't even mention. Because, you know, I do understand that not everyone is going to be talking about Moon Crystal and Kokoro. But hopefully you guys do check those games out, though. Because one thing that I do like about seeing people's, like, top favorite lists for this type of subject is that you can always find something new to play. And alright, I'm finished here. So the next one I'm going to be doing will be on the Sega Genesis. And I don't know when that will be, probably like a couple months maybe, but we'll see. So with that being said, thanks for watching and commenting, and have yourselves a great day.